Welcome to Stratford Literary Festival, and my name is John Jefferies. We were very disappointed that we had to cancel this spring's festival because of the COVID-19 outbreak, but we thought we'd bring you a taster of some of the events that you would have enjoyed. So welcome to Stratford Goes Virtual. I'm delighted today to introduce Catherine Belton, author of Putin's People. Catherine knows a very great deal about Russia. She's worked as the Moscow correspondent for the Financial Times and has reported on Russia for the Moscow Times and Business Week. The Sunday Times has called Putin's People a must-read book. And according to the Times Book of the Week, it reads like a thriller. The Observer praises Catherine's analysis as relentless and convincing, while the Daily Mail notes that Kremlin watchers in the West regard her analysis as indispensable to any understanding of Russia today. Catherine, this is a book that mixes recent history and contemporary politics. So I wonder, could you tell us something about the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's actually what led me to write the book in the first place, because it sort of struck me when I was reporting there in Moscow for many years, was that we really didn't understand exactly what happened at the Soviet fall. Obviously, the system collapsed, but in the chaos, everything was so fast moving, there was so much turmoil that a couple of things kind of got forgotten and left by the wayside. And what was really important and what really didn't get noticed very much was that at the turn of the sort of, in the last couple of years before the Soviet fall, there were elements within the KGB who were incredibly smart, and there were some of them who were sort of perhaps more progressive than the sort of the normal kind of hefty guys on the street who were sort of going after dissidents, who were the sort of the meatheads, you could say, who were just only knew the language of force. But there were some very intelligent guys in the foreign intelligence arm of the KGB who traveled wildly, and they saw sort of how much more advanced the Western system was than the Soviet Union. They knew the Soviet Union could never compete with the West under the conditions of the command economy. And so this was one of the sort of the key things that I found when I began investigating, when I began reporting the book, that there was this kind of element within the KGB who really sort of helped propel the Gorbachev's perestroika reforms from '85, this kind of reorganizing of the economy that would allow at least some element of competition within the economy, although at the beginning it was meant to be under strict control. They wanted to see, could there be some more competition so that the economy could become more innovative. But obviously it was impossible to keep under control, and it sort of let the genie out of the bottle. But sort of really what began then is that the KGB sort of began these sort of operations to start. They could see the writing was on the wall, not just for the Soviet Union, but for the entire sort of Eastern Bloc, that they couldn't sort of contain the dissent and protest that was rising, mainly because of the economic issues, that the people could also see that standards of living were much higher in the West, and they were resentful of this very heavy hand of the state. So I think they knew that they had to adjust. So you had perestroika and glasnost, and it was meant to be a controlled process. But all the while, in the background, there was this sort of element of the KGB, mainly the foreign intelligence arm, that were preparing for the regime fall. And they began sort of siphoning assets out of the Soviet Union, partly as a result of the perestroika reforms, but mainly most kind of export business or anything that you wanted to do then was essentially under the control of the foreign arm of the KGB. Its staff manned the Soviet Trade Ministry under the perestroika reforms. If you wanted to export something, whether it's metals or oil, you had to get permission from the Soviet Trade Ministry, you had to get licenses, and the KGB guys were the ones that controlled this process. So actually they were in charge of funneling an awful lot of assets out of the Soviet Union, which kind of also precipitated the collapse in a way. And they weren't just doing it. One of the things that perhaps the West hasn't understood properly always about sort of Soviet Union and Russia was that it's not just greed, it's not just to line your own pockets, but you can do that along the way, but it's also for strategic considerations. They were creating slush funds which would allow some of their networks, their foreign networks of agents and other kind of influence operations to survive, essentially.
Catherine, it seems to me from reading the book that in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, you had three very different groups, you know, Democrats, KGB, mafia, but they all kind of wanted the same thing, although for very different reasons. Is that right, do you think?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think probably that. I mean, as with any institution within the KGB, there was an old guard who, of course, didn't want anything to change. They thought we're the top dogs. You know, the Politburo is the top dog, and they were very resistant to any change. But as I explained, there was a sort of more nimble, more progressive element which saw that actually it was going to be in their interest to change, that it wasn't possible for a Soviet Union to compete with the West under the planned economy. So they actually sort of, you know, there were sort of KGB operatives who would ally themselves with some of the Democrats, and they also allied themselves with members of organized crime, because organized crime networks which were already sort of entrenched in some foreign countries, because some Soviet organized crime members had left the Soviet Union in the 70s and 80s when a wave of Jewish emigration was allowed, and so they already had sort of people in place in Western countries, and they could provide a very kind of convenient outlet through which they could funnel cash. I mean, I'm sure quite a lot of it got stolen on the way, but at least they would keep control of some of it. So it was kind of an alliance. And also you can also see this in what happened to Putin when he returned to Leningrad after his stint serving in Dresden in East Germany. Essentially he was told by his sort of former boss and mentor from Dresden that he should head home to Leningrad, and basically the first thing he did was to attach himself to the leaders of the city's democratic movement.
Well, how does Boris Yeltsin come into this? Because I guess without Yeltsin, there wouldn't have been Putin. And when I was reading the book, I wasn't in a sense sure what I felt about Yeltsin. Was he a bystander? Was he a villain? Was he possibly even a tragic hero? I mean, what's your feeling about Yeltsin?
I think in a way he was a tragic hero.
Really?
I think from the people that I've spoken to who were close to him, I think he really believed that he was bringing freedom to Russia. I think he was the leader who believed who kind of was a true believer in sort of in freeing the market and bringing, and you know, he had this famous phrase to the regional governors of Russia. He was sort of telling them to swallow as much freedom as you can. He really did try to liberate the kind of the media and the political system. And I think he wanted sort of young and active reformers in his government. But it was this great tragedy, though, because he was never able to fully free himself or his government from this sort of Soviet legacy, and mostly the legacy of the security services, who remained in the background, but at actually quite high levels, sort of at times in charge of sort of overseeing exports, which allowed them to sort of replenish their own kind of networks, and also kind of continue to exert some influence over policy. And that was the whole tragedy really of the 90s. So you had all these ideals that you were going to bring the market to Russia, but it was never actually fully implemented, because there were sort of old guard people in government, or you know, who didn't want to fully free things, who were only sort of looking after themselves. So, you know, I think
But you mentioned too the importance of, in your quotation marks, the family. I mean, do you think that Yeltsin was also brought down by, well, brought down, his reforms were ruined by the nepotism that surrounded him?
Yes, I think that was in some ways his oversight, but it was also, you know, it's being at the top of politics in Russia is it's like being in a snake pit. I mean, who do you trust? I mean, so for Yeltsin, I think yes, he's a family man, and he knew he could trust his family, you know, and the nearest to him was his daughter Tatiana Dachenka.
Yeah.
And the man who became her husband, this guy Valentin Yumashev, who started out as a journalist writing Yeltsin's memoirs, but they formed this very kind of close rapport. But yes, to some degree that was his undoing, sort of because it allowed sort of the opposition to sort of take pot shots at him and his family, and also kind of his family were, I don't think Yeltsin ever had any interest in money. I was told he didn't really understand what it was, that he kept a chunk of change in his safe in his office and handed over a wad of $100 bills to his bodyguard at one point, and sort of said, "Is this enough to buy a bottle of vodka?" His bodyguard was astonished, but it just shows it shows that he really didn't understand sort of money or anything like that, and this was sort of money he'd had from royalties. But he was involved in sort of higher things. But I think his daughters were sort of perhaps you know, they wanted to live a fine life, and perhaps they didn't really understand the strings that came with that. That's you know, that's debatable, and you know, it's not, but they did allow sort of a certain group of powerful businessmen in close, who also benefited from the closeness to the Yeltsin family and sort of won great assets through their ability to become sort of great lobbyists.
So what was it that made Putin so successful in this kind of maelstrom of, you know, corruption and infighting in different factions? What is it about Putin's personality that enabled him to become prime minister and so soon after president?
I think really because he was so low profile, I think for a long time, and he was always sort of working very quietly in the background, and he rose almost imperceptibly through the ranks of the Kremlin at a very great speed. I mean, he only moved to Moscow in 96, but his first job was as the head of the foreign property department in the Kremlin, and that's actually a vast empire of sort of Soviet, it was like a Soviet inheritance of embassies and huge property network abroad, and it was his job to oversee that. But he rose so rapidly, he became sort of head of the control department, which is a very powerful job, overlooking sort of policies in the regions and overseeing governors and so on. And then he became first deputy head of the administration, which is kind of within the space of about a year, which was a miraculous climb. And then he moved from there to become the head of the FSB. But at each stage of these sort of his kind of career rise, this stage of his promotion, he was sort of Valentin Yumashev, who was the Kremlin chief of staff and Yeltsin's future son-in-law, was overseeing his rise, and I think he'd been very impressed with Putin's sort of demonstrations of loyalty to his former boss in St. Petersburg, who was this renowned Democrat and liberal, Anatoly Sobchak. And I think so. Yumashev told me of one particular incident that had impressed him. So Sobchak was under fire from sort of old guard kind of factions in the Kremlin. They wanted to arrest him under a corruption scandal, which Putin believed was just cooked up by his enemies, that it was an ideological game. And so Putin told Yumashev ahead of time that he was going to spirit his former boss out of harm's way and take him out of Russia. So essentially, he was sort of showing to Yumashev that he was willing to break the law to protect somebody he was very loyal to.
Do you think that the Yeltsin family were thinking that too, that when Yeltsin left office, he would be protected by Putin, the family would be protected by Putin?
Yes, I think really this was the key, and that was the sort of the moment that they realized that sort of Putin was someone who would go to great lengths to kind of protect the people he was loyal to. And because Putin had been so low key, kind of very self-effacing, he'd never sort of shown himself to be particularly ambitious. In fact, at one point, I think just before he became first deputy head of the administration, he'd said, well, I think I've done my work now. I'd like to step down and retire. He was always sort of, whether it was, I think it was probably more pretense, really, because he was just sort of proving himself to be reliable. He didn't want anything for himself. He just became someone that they could sort of count on. No matter what. And when it came to the very crucial moment in '99, the Yeltsin family were under fire. So the KGB and the communists had sensed opportunity. In a way, they were smelling blood. There had been this horrible financial crisis in August '98, which left Yeltsin very weakened. He was in hospital most of the time, and really, in the background, sort of members of the security service who had been biding their time had access to sort of credit card accounts, which Yeltsin's family had been using. And the sums involved are minuscule compared to the corruption scandals of today. But in those days, it was enough really to topple Yeltsin, because the communists were still dominating the Duma and his popularity was so low.
One of the really shocking things I think about the book, Catherine, is that once Putin does achieve power, some very, very dark things happen. There are a number of unexplained deaths, which you talk about in the book, including possibly even Anatoly Sobchak, who, of course, was, his great mentor. There's even some suggestion that some of these awful events, which we all remember, the Beiran siege, the Dubrovka siege, the apartment bombings, may have had something to do with the Kremlin. I'm just wondering, how are decisions made in Russia? Is it possible ever to trace these to Putin? Or is it more like Thomas à Becket? Are there people working for Putin who think this is something that he might like? Is it possible to speculate about how decisions are made in the Kremlin?
I think it's possible to speculate to some degree. I tried, while I was doing reporting for the book, to speak to people who'd sort of been part of Putin's inner circle for a time, and it seemed to me that the mechanism, it's not clear. It allows room for this very important plausible deniability, but it seems rather than Putin himself giving direct orders, he'll make suggestions which people are meant to sort of understand, how they will, but there's an implicit kind of recommendation in the suggestions, or in the instances of sort of these various kind of terrible terrorist attacks, then really the suggestion is that in those days, the head of the security service then was Nikolai Patrushev, who was somebody who was more senior than Putin actually within the security service structure when Putin came to power. And he was somebody who was actually probably the most ruthless of all of them. And it may be that it would be him who would sort of go and make a suggestion that perhaps, dear President, we should do something like this, and but it's also, they're so close. It's kind of a question of what comes first, chicken or the egg,
And what do you think that Putin wants domestically and in terms of foreign policy? I mean, does he have a vision of Russia's place in the world?
I think for a long time he's been wanting a sort of a greater seat at the table, a bigger voice for Russia. I think the problem that we're facing now is it's really this legacy of the Soviet collapse. I think because you have these sort of KGB types running the country for whom the Soviet collapse was really a bitter blow, and this loss of a kind of world power status all they care about in life is restoring Russia's power on the world stage. And as long as they can hold power at home, they don't really care what's happening domestically. All their attention is focused on kind of gaining sort of more, as they see it, respect for Russia within the West, within the Western world. And unfortunately, rather than winning respect by sort of carrying out sort of great and amazing economic reforms at home, which allow their economy to flourish, they prefer to sort of spend all their cash on influence operations in the West instead, and buying off politicians.
Some years ago, Catherine, I heard Christopher Coker at London School of Economics say that Russia always wants to be invited to the party so that she can ruin it. Do you think that's right?
Unfortunately, to some degree, yes. But I think that may only be because for a long time they felt themselves ignored. So it's kind of like, you know, I think Obama had this description of Putin once, that he's like this naughty schoolboy at the back of the class, sort of pulling faces and so on. I think really because when you feel ignored and humiliated, the tendency is to disrupt. And that's what we're seeing here, because, you know, I think the West was a little complacent about sort of Russia and its intentions. I think they thought sort of all these sort of power games would be long over. I think they hoped and believed that Russia was going to integrate with the West instead of sort of trying to impose its own disruption onto the Western world.
It does seem from the book, Catherine, there's a lot of wishful thinking with Russia, and there aren't many people, I think, who come out of the book well. I thought Joe Biden came out of it pretty well, as did John McCain. I mean, it seems that really all other Western leaders, from George W. Bush to Tony Blair to Donald Trump, basically don't see the threat, the challenge, the menace from Russia. They just think that somehow we could accommodate Russia. And I'm just really wondering, is it possible to accommodate Putin's Russia? Or essentially, are we looking at a rogue state here? Which I think is what John McCain used to say.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And obviously, I think, yes, for too long, the West has been accommodating, and it's allowed sort of the Putin's Russia to act with impunity. And they do to such a degree that they haven't sort of faced any kind of backlash. You know, they will kind of openly thumb their nose at the West via sort of the very kind of open killings of sort of ex-agents like Skripal 2 years ago. I mean, sure, if they wanted to kill him quietly, they could have done so, but they sent two stooges to kill him, you know, with sort of, you know, poison. I think, you know, I think they to some degree, they get their kicks from thumbing their nose at Western niceties. But, you know, I'm not an academic and I'm not a policy maker. So, you know, I don't think that change in Russia, even, you know, I think there's a danger now of also getting into a kind of spiraling escalation of animosity. And I don't think that there is a way to deal with it apart from through containment until there's change within Russia itself, because I think the Putin regime itself is boxing itself into a corner and it can't last.
I mean, have you ever met or spoken with Putin?
No, I haven't, but I have spoken to people who've been very close to him.
And how willing have they been to speak, would you say? I mean, it must be quite a difficult book to write, because a lot of it is very shocking. I mean, did you find it easy to access this information? Probably not easy at all, I would have thought.
I think I was lucky to some degree because as an FT reporter, you have tremendous access to all kinds of sort of quite high-placed officials and businessmen and so on. And I was very privileged to have that post. And sort of during my time as the Moscow correspondent for the FT, I sort of built up rapport with a number of businessmen and officials, and was able to sort of continue those relationships while I was working on my book. I did begin reporting while while I was still in Moscow. But I actually left, I have been working on this book for a long time. I left in 2014, just when the atmosphere was turning over Ukraine, because my sources became also more wary of speaking to journalists then, especially Western ones. And I found that sort of when I moved back to London, most of them were still coming to London, and in fact that they were more open about talking. I think some of them, you know, I think they want to explain their point of view and where they're coming from, and some of them want to kind of make sure that there is still some kind of dialogue. I think they want to be understood. They don't want to kind of have a complete sort of isolation and closing down of relations. But along the way, sometimes they'll admit to stuff that perhaps they shouldn't.
I mean, a final question, Catherine, but what do you think Russia will look like after Putin? I mean, are you at all optimistic about what the future could look like?
It's a more and more difficult question, because I think the whole of Russia is now in flux, like many other countries in the world, but perhaps Russia more so because the stage had been set essentially for Putin to enshrine his place in power for many, many more years. But the vote on him remaining president has now been sort of put off because of the COVID virus. And meanwhile, the economy is going to be tanking, and they're going to be facing a steep recession. Millions could be laid off. So, you know, he's facing the very biggest challenge of his presidency, and already his ratings are low. And I think the economic challenges at home will be such that it's not that he can go launch some kind of small victorious war somewhere to distract everyone, because it's not going to work when people are losing their jobs. So, you know, he faces a very tough mandate right now, and probably if he will find a successor, he'll have to find a successor from the ranks of the security men. It will have to be somebody who will protect and guarantee his interests. But the big question is, who can he trust to do that? But I think given the economic issues and the fact that Russia has already undergone this kind of prolonged period of isolation, something in me is still optimistic that perhaps he will pick someone more progressive, because again, it's almost the same situation as at the end of the Soviet Union, when really I think sort of people around the leader understand that things are unsustainable, that the current sort of standoff can't sort of continue because it's not benefiting either side.
So, Catherine, we began with the end of the Soviet Union 30 years ago. Do you think that we could be in a similar epoch-changing situation today with the last years of Putin, potentially?
It's possible. People are sort of making those comparisons now. Sort of quite senior economists in Russia are saying that the situation that Russia could be facing, if it does enter into a steep recession, will be the same as the final years of the Soviet Union. So I think in a way that there will be the same challenges.
Thank you so much, Catherine. That was fascinating.
Thank you.
And thank you too for watching. There's a link on the Festivals Go virtual pages for ordering Catherine's book, and other interviews are also available on the page. See you all at our Winter Festival in November, and stay safe. Thank you.